Hey everyone, and welcome to the third section of the course where we're going to discuss race and racism in U.S. politics and public policy. We will be using the book The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, and it's been a favorite of pretty much all of the previous classes, so hopefully you all enjoy it as much as they did. And she frames this question at the beginning, which is, why can't we have nice things? And we're going to answer throughout this class. This is why we can't have nice things, and by this we mostly mean racism and its effects on public policy. Now, yes, there are other reasons we can't have nice things. Building good institutions is hard in general. But racism has played a major role in the institutions we have, and particularly in the reasons the institutions we have often don't function as well as we'd like them to. Okay, so let's start with this idea from public policy process in the formal sense that one framework we might have for thinking about public policies is called narrative policy framework. And this is formally defined as a framework that starts by assuming that participants in the policy process tell stories, and those stories have consistent structural features such as characters, morals, and plots. So this is a new theory. A lot of older theories focused more on institutions or more on rational choice economics and incentive structures. And I think all of these theories do tell us something about the policy process. Like, the reason these theories persist and proliferate is because they're useful for at least some element of thinking about public policy. There are some books from outside the discipline that I think make a pretty strong case for narrative theory. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari is a really interesting overview of basically all of human history that places a central emphasis on how stories and that we tell each other have shaped everything. And within moral philosophy, After Virtue by McIntyre is a classic that really focuses on narrative and meaning and how humans work within narratives in order to understand ethics. So there's one other book, though, that I want to spend most of our time on, or at least a good chunk of time on here, that I think is really fascinating. It's by Arlie Russell Hochschild, who's a sociologist, and she wrote the book Strangers in Their Own Land. She also followed up earlier this year with the book Stolen Pride, which might be of particular interest to this group because it's based in Kentucky. But we're going to focus on her first book because it really lays out the logic of deep stories in a way that's very much related to the issues of race and racism in the U.S. So first, let's start with what a deep story is. A deep story is a feels as if story. It's the story feelings tell in the language of symbols. It removes judgment, it removes facts, it tells us how things feel. And then Hochschild argues, I don't believe we understand anyone's politics, right or left, without it, for we all have a deep story. Okay, and this deep story that she pieces together comes from spending years in the early 2010s in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Because her book came out a little before 2016, it became known in some ways as like an explanation for Trump being elected. But note that her actual research was about Tea Party attitudes, and it is, I think, notable how well this sort of translates into the Trump era. So she argues that this story that's being told on the American right starts with a scene of waiting in line. So someone is patiently waiting in a line that goes up a hill, and the top of the hill is the American dream. You're stuck. Work, particularly in Lake Charles, Louisiana, involved dangerous chemicals, long hours, layoffs, few raises, and prices for food, housing, and education all keep going up. Right? So you can hear echoes of this sort of story today in terms of increases in pricing through inflation, irritation about work. Notably today, work by most economic indicators is going quite well. The growth in wages has outpaced the growth in inflation, and this is particularly true at the bottom of the economic ladder. Inequality has actually gone down over the past 4 years. It's still amazing to me that this isn't actually a bigger deal, but it has. But the idea is that you're this person and it hasn't gone well for you or your neighbors, and In principle, you wish everyone could achieve the American dream, but you've been waiting for a long time. And then you see some people cutting in line, and no one likes people cutting in line, right? But no, the actual interpretation being placed on here is that affirmative action, welfare benefits, government initiatives are forms of line cutting. I understand, of course, not all of you will agree with that, and this is part of why we all have different politics. But her argument here is that this is a metaphor that's going to help understand like what it feels like, and part of what drives drives voting on the American right. And so her argument is that black people, women, immigrants, refugees, and even environmental considerations are all cutting in line ahead of you and the things you need. So to quote from the book directly, you feel uneasy. It has to be said, the line cutters irritate you. They are violating rules of fairness. You resent them and you feel it's right that you do. So do your friends. Fox commentators reflect your feelings, for your deep story is also the Fox News deep story. You're a compassionate person, but now you're being asked to extend your sympathy to all the people who have cut in front of you. So you have to have your guard up against requests for sympathy. Scene 3. Betrayal. Someone should be monitoring the line, but instead, President Obama seems to be on the side of the line cutters. You see him waving to the line cutters. He's helping them. He feels extra sympathy for them that he doesn't feel for you. He's on their side. He's telling you these line cutters deserve special treatment, that they've had a harder time than you've had. You don't live near the line cutters or have close friends in most categories of the line cutters, but from what you can see or hear on Fox News, the real story doesn't correspond to his story about the line cutters. And if you note, this is backed up through polling. Essentially, large segments of the American right simply do not believe that people outside of their demographic have had a harder time. Objective indicators generally indicate that that's wrong. You can do blind studies and send out, say, resumes where the only thing that differs is whether the name is Greg or Emily versus Lakeisha and Jamal. That was a fairly famous study, and unsurprisingly, people with names that indicated that they were likely black got far, far fewer callbacks on their resumes than the generic white people names, Greg and Emily, right? And this is a study that's been replicated more than once, right? So like we can see in all sorts of indicators. You can also see in like the makeup of current Congress, the makeup of CEOs, right? Like you could go down the list in terms of advantages and disadvantages concretely, but that's not the story that is being told. I think it is also worth noting that there's also differences in how racism is even defined, where a conservative definition of racism is overt hatred or using slurs, while a liberal definition is saying prejudice, bias, any sort of belief in a hierarchy. That's what racism is, right? So like these are even different definitions of the word racism. There's also, a big gender divide here, like both across parties in voting patterns. This is becoming more pronounced, but also within the Republican Party, men are consistently more likely to identify as Tea Party, and I believe as MAGA, but I have not actually looked at an update in terms of gender divide from Tea Party to the Trump era, but it would surprise me if that had reversed. So, this also, sort of leads to the question of like, in this situation, people look around for allies. And so far, those allies seem to be, in some case, the free market, right? So you get this polarization where even though on the right, certain policies like tax cuts for the wealthy are in fact not even particularly popular among rank and file Republicans, they nonetheless prefer that sort of allyship in order to prevent what they view as this deep unfairness of line cutting. Okay, And so McGee really wants to flip the script on this, right? She wants to say, we shouldn't look at this as just, one line where people get ahead or behind. And she says, like, this narrative where white people see the well-being of people of color as a threat to their own is this really powerful story and really also harmful, right? Like, the new story she wants to tell is racism is a poison first consumed by its concoctors. So in the sense of racism harms everyone, including the people who are being racist, right? And the book then focuses on how those harms have come about. So, drained pool politics and racism draining the pool. Public goods. The technical economic definition is it's something non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And so if you use the phrase public goods around an economics professor in a non-technical way, they will probably correct you. But in everyday use, we're mostly just talking about something that like large segments of the public benefits from, but probably won't get funded without an adequate coordination mechanism. So what happened is during the era of desegregation, local councils often decided to literally drain public swimming pools rather than share with their black neighbors. So this happened in Montgomery, but it also happened in several other cities across the country. There's a lot of broad-ranging impacts here, but one direct impact is that drowning is the top killer of young children in the U.S., and black kids are 2 to 3 times as likely to drown as white kids. And to some extent, like this question of availability to pools and swimming lessons as a child probably has at least some relationship to that disproportional outcome. So McGee argues that racism is working against non-wealthy white Americans in 2 ways. One, it lowers their support for government actions that could help them economically out of a zero-sum fear that it could help the racialized undeserving as well. I think Medicaid expansion is a good example of this playing out. And then the racial polarization of the system forced a choice between class interest and racial interest. And in every presidential election since the Civil Rights Act, the majority of white people chose the party of their race. So, I mean, it's important here that drain pool politics, like it's a very stark example of just getting rid of something that was beneficial rather than integrating it. But we see this play out across education, mass incarceration policies, healthcare, childcare, infrastructure, police brutality. Like all of these things affect both white people and black people. And part of the reason that it is really hard to get them fixed in our politics is because of this drain pool politics that we still have, or the legacy of this that's still going on today. One other thing I want to point out as we think about government programs and who they benefit is there are often misconceptions about what counts as a government program. So Suzanne Mettler wrote this great book called The Submerged State, and she notes that over half of people in the U.S. claim they have never used a government program. In reality, well over 90% have. So this suggests there's this big disconnect where people use government programs and then don't even realize that they're beneficiaries of government programs. The ones with the highest rate of usage where people don't recognize them are the mortgage interest deduction and 529s. 529 is a college savings account, and mortgage interest deduction means that when you pay interest on your mortgage, you can deduct it from your taxes. I want to note that these are actually really big, really expensive programs. The mortgage interest deduction is about 4 times the size of all of our housing investments on the poor. Again, 4 times as big, right? So we have a bunch of wealthy people, or, middle class and wealthy people who own houses and get a huge government benefit and do not recognize that it's a government benefit, but then are upset that the government doesn't do things for them, but is instead doing things for people who are poorer than them. Because, again, we sort of design public policy in a way where it sort of just fits into the background, right? So I don't mean this solely as a let's blame people for things, right? Like, I understand why someone would sit down and fill out their taxes and get a deduction and not think of it as like receiving a government program. But in reality, it's a huge government outlay, right? Like budgetarily, it costs the government a bunch of money. So it either has to come from deficit or taxes elsewhere or cutting other programs. And so at that point, we really are talking about, a design that fails to actually show people that it is beneficial, which makes it in some ways not particularly sustainable, perhaps. Anyway, tax expenditures are about half of federal discretionary spending. Retirement savings, employer health insurance, and mortgage interest deduction are the three largest ones. So, this is a problem. Mettler puts it very bluntly, saying the greater the number of tax breaks an individual had benefited from, the more likely he or she was to disagree that government had provided an opportunity for an improved standard of living, right? So you're getting direct money off of your taxes, but then not thinking that this increases your standard of living. That said, like any attempt to close these sort of tax expenditures, or when people try to close them, they call them tax loopholes. But either way, any attempt to close these does generally meet with at least some opposition from interest groups. So it's unclear if people do recognize how much they benefit them, but it's just not top of mind on surveys. But also, if you don't think about public policy all the time, you're probably not thinking about all of this together when some random surveyor asks you a question. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover for the introduction and first three chapters. I have a lot of discussion questions and looking forward to a great discussion this week.